Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Alessandro Accorsi, a senior analyst for social media and conflict at the International Crisis Group. Prior to joining ICG, he worked for 5 years at the European External Action Service, where he led a task force countering foreign interference and information manipulation in the Middle East. He also worked for 5 years as a freelance journalist in Cairo. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Alessandro Accorsi, welcome to Babel.
Thank you for having me.
Who is active promoting disinformation in the Middle East, and how are they doing it?
In terms of actors, there are several. There are regional actors, there are international actors. For decades, the information ecosystem in the region has been closed, tightly controlled, either by countries themselves or by countries that had regional aspirations. Nasser first with the radio, the Saudi channels, regional channels, etc. Social media proved to be a very cheap and useful way of achieving that goal. Then different countries had different capacities, and they also had different goals. Egypt, for example, never really developed capacities to use their influence operations outside of the Egyptian ecosystem. For them, the goal was always to try and control the domestic space, while other countries, like the Gulf countries, most notably, used influence operations to expand and extend their regional hegemony. You had the Qatar Rift back in 2017, which some dubbed the first social media Cold War, in the sense that no shots were fired, but it was only fought online and on media. You have the Libyan civil war, or at least like the Tripoli offensive, where Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, partly Egypt, used influence operations on a very tactical level as well during the offensive. And then obviously you have more recent examples like the war in Gaza, both in 2021 and 2023.
And you said that it's partly state actors, but also non-state actors are in this space.
It's mostly state actors. Then sometimes, obviously, you have a few non-state actors. The real example from non-state actors is mostly ISIS, their use of social media for propaganda and for recruitment. But you also have other recent examples where we suspect that there are state actors behind those operations. For example, in the tensions between Morocco and Algeria. So at one point, weird enough, in the fringes of internet and social media in the two countries, there was this emergence of very small accounts that dubbed themselves as the Moorish movement. They were actually very much inspired by the American alt-right. They used the same tropes, the same memes of Pepe the Frog and other things that were really taken from the American alt-right. And they were repurposed in the Moroccan context first, and then we saw a reaction from Algeria. So they were trying to push a very right-wing, hyper-nationalist, even ethnic supremacist approach, where they would really try to troll other users, try to instigate a climate of hyper-nationalism in the country. It started in Morocco, and the response came from Algeria. It was very short-lived, but somehow it created a little bit of additional tensions in the relationship between the two countries.
Do you see disinformation and misinformation as very distinct things?
There are distinct things. So misinformation, the difference isn't how deliberate it is. The way I usually explain it is by saying misinformation is your aunt sending a WhatsApp message with something that might be fake or misleading. Disinformation is actually writing something that we know to be fake and misleading and circulating it on purpose with the intent of deceiving. The two obviously coexist together, and disinformation feeds off misinformation. Usually there are narratives that can be introduced in an information environment that are able to circulate because we have a general misinformation problem.
What kinds of impacts do you see disinformation having? I mean, in terms of discrete impacts, and how often do you see them being the intended impacts?
Disinformation had different goals and different uses over the years. So, as I mentioned before, at one point, Gulf countries used to use them for widening their regional hegemony and regional power. And it was very interesting because we could see, for example, by tracking node networks of trolls and electronic armies linked to Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, etc., we could kind of see where the policy line was going to. So the official discourse coming from the States would go in one direction, but then online, we saw that certain narratives, different ones, were being circulated and that were preparing the ground for a shift in the policy direction. What was interesting, to give you an example, when OPEC decided to raise the price of oil, the official explanation from Saudi Arabia was that this had nothing to do with tensions between Saudi Arabia and the US, and this was only done for economic purposes. But then online, the trolls in Arabic were actually pushing a very anti-US line and saying other things, saying that this was done actually in contraposition to the Biden administration and other things. We've seen this kind of game played several times where, for example, around the Abraham Accords, we saw the same things. Normalization with Israel in general, intra-Palestinian politics.
Why does this matter in non-democratic societies where public opinion doesn't shape government action?
It doesn't matter in terms of public consent, but it does matter in terms of stability, especially in countries that are either in conflict or at risk of conflict. Especially in countries that are experiencing an active conflict, this matters a lot because civilians rely on information to make life or death decisions. If we take Sudan, for example, or Gaza, people fleeing violence rely on sources of information to decide where to flee, where to go, where to receive aid, where to gather, but also they rely on technology, not only on social media, to receive aid. We push for the digitalization of aid in terms of humanitarian planning, delivery. We collect way more data, everything is digital, and this has consequences on civilians. So the information operations can aim to confuse people by slowing down, for example, confusing them so that they flee in a wrong direction, putting them at risk, but also getting them in harm's way. So like slowing down, for example, the advancement of an enemy. We saw that a lot during the Tribal Offensive. We've seen that in Sudan, for example. But it can also impact the policy responses and humanitarian aid responses, for example, emergency responses. We've seen this in Gaza. If you have campaigns targeting UNRWA, campaigns targeting NGOs, and targeting civilian facilities, for example, it becomes first less safe for emergency responders to deliver aid. It becomes much harder to gather information on the needs of the population, what is needed and how to deliver it, and becomes much harder for civilians to receive that kind of aid.
I can sort of imagine why governments would be interested in maybe passively whipping up some nationalist support in the face of shift in oil production. I have a harder time understanding why governments would want to put more civilians at risk in the midst of domestic conflicts.
It's not always the intention to put more civilians at risk. Sometimes it can be. But what's clear, and it's becoming more and more clear, is that information operations are a very cheap tool in war and conflict. At best, they can be an insurance policy to undermine the stability of a country, to prolong conflict, to undermine also peace resolution and mediation efforts. It's also a cheap way to prop up the image of one party in the conflict compared to the other, to create areas of influence, to prop up new players. But it has as an unintended consequence most of the time, the fact that civilians are put in harm's way. Information operations, information warfare, electronic warfare, the use of internet shutdowns, for example, and communication shutdowns are increasingly used as a tool of war. Usually, it is thought that they help on the military battlefield and that they're used for military reasons. In reality, their impact on the military operations is very little, but they have huge consequences on civilian lives. And then obviously in the post-conflict situation, as I said, it's an insurance policy. It's a way of undermining the stability of a country, of exerting some influence and controlling the space.
Russians are very active in this space. They've been active in this space for a long time. One of the places they've been active is Syria. As you look at it, were the Russians successful in their information operations despite having a failed Syria policy, or was the failure of their information operations part of a broader failure of policy, or was just the information operations are too marginal to actually tip things decisively one way or the other in a conflict like Syria?
Information operations alone cannot win conflicts. If you have a bad policy or you don't have enough resources, they're not going to win a conflict. They can be very helpful for tactical uses in trying to gain a little bit of advantage. Information operations were instrumental for Russia in Syria in the period when Russia made Syria a priority in their foreign policy, where they intervened in support of the Assad regime. They created enough space to use chemical attacks, not only once, but possibly multiple times, to bomb civilians in Aleppo, to commit atrocities, and to keep some space also for the Syrian regime to survive longer than probably it could have. 60 days ago, before the Assad regime fell, we were talking about normalization with Syria. Everyone was taking for granted that Syria was a safe place for refugees to return, part of one of the Russian narratives, that the regime was not worse than the alternatives, and that was done, that Assad was back into meetings with foreign powers and the regime in Russia had won the war. They were successful in hiding prolonged instances of resistance throughout these years, even in regime-held areas. When people protested, for example, against the cut of subsidies on bread, in several instances, when there was dissent inside regime-held areas, they were very successful in playing those concerns down and projecting a certain image. We see now what happens. Syria is facing a transition where the fall of the Assad regime did not only leave a vacuum of power, security, and governance, it also left an information vacuum. The Assad regime, together with Russia and Iran, had created some kind of like information iron dome that shielded the population that was under its control from information narratives that would come from outside. Over 14 years, the Syrian opposition created a strong civil society, strong independent media, but all in the diaspora or in Idlib and the northeast. The population inside the regime-held areas, they were at the end, told every day. They were bombarded with propaganda. They were told that the opposition, they were just terrorists. They created a sectarian tensions. That fragmentation of the information iron dome left a large part of the Syrian population primed for misinformation and disinformation. And there's no real old regime kind of media that is surviving and is operating. That fracturing of that ecosystem led to many domestic and international actors, including Russia, being able to run their own influence operations to fuel hatred, to fuel incitement, to fuel sectarian tensions, and at best use it as an insurance policy to make sure that the transition is unstable, and at worst actually lead to either a single catalytic event that can descend the country into sectarian violence and a new civil war.
As somebody who first went to Syria in 1991, I think the Iron Dome long predated the uprising of 2011, and it may have been fine-tuned, but certainly the distrust that Syrians had for any information source was cultivated by the government for many, many decades.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the regime was in place since the 50s. Disinformation Iron Dome has been long there. I remember I went to Syria in 2008, and I remember at one point, one night, a friend of mine finally decided to lock himself with me in my room, ask me to take all the blankets we had in the house and cover our heads and hide in there, and whispering, he started talking politics. And the first thing he told me is like, next time you see all the friends you make here, check the shoes. If they're polished, they're mukhabarat. They're information estate agents. They were everywhere. They were controlling everything.
Is there a difference between these kinds of information operations in chronic cases versus acute cases? I mean, I'm thinking of the immediate uproar in the Arab world in October 2023, when there was a claim that Israel had bombed Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza. Shortly thereafter, it came out that it was unlikely to be an Israeli bombs. But by then, the narrative had changed. And it really flipped the Arab world and got Arab publics engaged suddenly. Does acute disinformation or misinformation work differently than the sort of chronic multi-decade drip that we've just been talking about?
Definitely. Partly because of how our attention span works, partly because of how even social media works, right? There's a short news cycle. We are fed with trending information. So the news of the day or the news of the week is dominating public conversation and can often trickle down into different echo chambers and bubbles and reaches people that are not even on social media. But I think like the Gaza war was very much different from previous wars in Gaza. In previous wars, starting from 2014, when social media first started playing a role, what happened was that Israel started massive bombing campaigns, applying the Haia doctrine, and Palestinians on the ground in Gaza turned to social media to document what was happening and share it with the rest of the world. After nearly 2 months of war, President Obama decided that it was enough and the war had to stop. From there, we've seen changes that the Israeli state, for example, did to their strategic communications and influence operations, right? They understood that from a military point of view, they had to make changes to contest that space. The IDF opened a YouTube channel. They had opened it before, but they started being more active. They started to post the kind of videos that we've grown very familiar with, like drone footage, and we see a hospital or mosque being bombed with explanation of this is a terrorist base or it's a base for Hamas or where they store weapons. And at the same time, they started also what has been called digital militarism. So inside Israel, trying to, using social media and especially Instagram, make militarism and make nationalism more present and more widespread to create a critical mass of people who could then be mobilized online to counter and contest this space. We've seen this again in 2021 to the point that the failure from platforms to adequately moderate content and conversations online led on one side to the over-enforcement of what we could call censorship of moderation, to the point that the hashtag Sheikh Jarrah around the protests that preceded the war in Gaza was actually effectively banned from Facebook and Instagram, and millions of Palestinians and people in the Arab world lost trust in the platform. And on the other side, lack of moderation of content in Hebrew led to the circulation of all sort of misinformation and incitement, especially among WhatsApp groups, but also private Facebook groups that contributed to escalating tensions inside Israel proper, and mob violence in mixed communities against Palestinian citizens of Israel. In the first 3 months of this war, Israel did not try to contest the center. They did not go for the moderate public international opinion, despite the horrors that happened on October 7. But they tried to create and separate two different echo chambers. And anyone was forced to take side. You were either on the side of the Palestinians, hence you were a supporter of Hamas and all of that, or you were standing with Israel. Incidents like the Al-Hali hospital became a battle of narratives. And for every single incident that happened afterwards, it was very hard to actually have proper investigations on the ground because the access was restricted. For every fact, there was an alternative version of events. If we think of the so-called Flower Massacre in February 2024, Palestinians who were approaching a humanitarian convoy to get flour, they were attacked. Israel says that the Palestinians were trying to attack the soldiers that were protecting the convoy. Shots were fired in the air, and as a result, it was a stampede and people died. Palestinians and human rights organizations claimed that actually the people who died did not die because of the stampede, but they were shot and that Israeli soldiers opened fire. But the moment that happened and the first news started circulating, there were accounts online that started reading, planting the seeds of an alternative version of events that was using the same feel and look of open source intelligence investigation. So drone footage, edited footage, analysis, geolocation, all this kind of stuff to present a different version of events. And what happened by separating people in two echo chambers is that when people are bombarded by contrasting information on topics that are extremely complex to make sense of, people retreat to their own confirmation biases. And that's what happened. Everyone went back to believe the facts that they wanted to believe. Everyone went back to their own confirmation biases. And that created a complete separation in narrative that created enough space, at least until February, to create more room for the war.
Do you see Hamas and Hamas supporters also engaging in misinformation, A? And B, do you think in doing so, they fell into an Israeli trap?
Yes, although I would make a distinction. First, Hamas used influence operations from the early morning of October 7th. The first images of October 7 and the attacks that Hamas conducted were circulated in private Telegram groups that reached Israeli citizens before their own media could report on it. So that was a psychological effect that Hamas had studied and had prepared by setting up these groups and trying to have a shock and awe operation that was amplified via social media, via GoPro videos, that was really meant to delay any Israeli counter operation. And also incite a strong response from Israel. When it comes to Palestinian supporters and pro-Palestinians, I do think that they fell into a trap because we saw, especially at the beginning, a lot of accelerationist groups, a lot of anti-Semitic groups, a lot of right-wing groups trying to take over a narrative of the false flag attack. 7 October was a false flag attack and all that kind of stuff. I think they also fell in a very easy trap, at least at the beginning, because this was an asymmetric conflict, not only on the ground, but also in the information space. You don't have the same level of organization. It's the pro-Palestinian supporters. It's not the Palestinian state. Second, there's an asymmetry in diplomatic and political power. Israel can do platform diplomacy. They can actively lobby platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter to take down content. Israel had launched more than 1,000 requests for takedown of content in the first month of the war, while the Palestinians couldn't do it. And then there was another problem, the over-enforcement of moderation in some cases that led to some censoring of Palestinian speech. Again, it happened on Instagram and it happened on Facebook, led to many pro-Palestinians to think that they were outnumbered, outplayed, and they were not playing even on not only an even level field, but they were also playing not according to the same rules. And I think that led to them fall in the trap of using at times misinformation and disinformation to try and steer back or fight back.
What kinds of trends do you see developing in the information space in the Middle East?
We've seen a shift from state-linked accounts to accounts that are run by small networks, sometimes linked to these PR companies, and it's harder to attribute their action to a specific actor. We've seen this, for example, at the beginning of the war in Sudan, with some weird, small, coordinated, inauthentic behavior trying to prop up internationally the profile of the RSF. It seems that these operations were run by a PR company based in Dubai. We don't know and we cannot attribute it to any government. But we see these kind of influence operations run by these networks. In Syria right now, for example, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Part of it, we suspect, it's run by regional and international powers, Russia, Iran, China, others. But a lot of it is domestic. It's the result of these previous networks that made up this Iron Dome that fragmented. And at first, they kind of went quiet and disappeared, and then they started reemerging. And we imagine that that's part of remnants of the old regime. Some of these operations seem to have the involvement of bots and inauthentic accounts that are linked to either countries in Southeast Asia that are known to have bot and click farms like Vietnam and Indonesia, or accounts that might come from Israel and UAE. And those accounts are not, it doesn't mean that they're linked to the government of Israel or the government of the Emirati government, but they might be linked to PR companies that are operating for money to run these campaigns. That is one big transformation that we're seeing because these operations are becoming smaller, they're becoming more deceptive, harder to pin down to a specific actor. AI is having an impact in these influence operations, in this gun for hire disinformation industry. Everyone thought that generative AI and the AI revolution was going to lead to deep fakes everywhere and to, imposter content, et cetera, et cetera. We don't actually see that much, especially because there is no lack of content. The way AI is having an impact is by being able for this industry to be able to create avatars, to create fake personas that can have an online account and that can be controlled by a single person. Like a single person can control thousands of these accounts, and each of them have specific preferences, a tone, a style, certain things that they might be doing, and generate speech and generate written content on their own and amplify this certain narrative or influence operations.
I certainly see that the quality of the grammar in phishing emails I get has improved. And this is, targeted phishing emails, spear phishing things that come from hostile actors in the Middle East. I get several a year, and they're getting better.
That is a huge problem because there is a wealth of personal data that can be mined and that can be used by malign actors to target those people, from big AI operations of using AI to target civilians in military operations to even just stealing personal data for doxing and for exposing people online to the point where small groups of people can organize to kill someone, to threaten someone. We've seen that in Iraq. In 2017, there was a huge rise in targeted assassinations with personal data that was circulated online. We've seen it in other places.
What's the policy response to all the things that we've been talking about? And clearly it's not one thing because we've talked about a complicated problem, but ICG is known for having a lot of recommendations for a lot of different actors. For somebody listening to this and say, oh my God, we have to do something. What do you think the most important things to do, especially from an outside perspective? I mean, what are the things that really affect Western policy, Western security, and what are the appropriate Western responses to these phenomena?
From a Western perspective, we only consider the information space as a critical security liability or threat when it attacks our own interest. So we only pay attention when Russia is conducting information operations in Africa and then everyone freaks out, or against the US or against Ukraine or against Europe, right? But we tend not to consider the information space as a security priority. And to me, the information space is a security priority because a lot of the stability of countries, especially countries that are not democratic, is based on the stability of their information space. If you have a culture of independent media, professional media, that will be reflected in the quality of your institutions overall. Information is key, not only to win conflicts, but also to build stability, to govern transitions, to secure countries. So it is a security interest that the US and the EU should have. And unfortunately, we see that the tide is going in a different direction. Platforms are disengaging. Platforms are increasingly abdicating their own social responsibilities. X has completely destroyed everything that Twitter was in terms of content moderation. Meta, for now, is only applying changes to the US. We'll see what happens in the rest of the world, but it's in a process of deinstitutionalizing a culture of safety and content moderation that was built over the past 8 years after the failures, the deadly failures in Myanmar, Ethiopia, Cameroon, and other places where Facebook platform contributed to the genocide of the Rohingya people. TikTok is trying, but not very transparent. But, like Western countries usually and Western donors give some money for independent media, for media support. They never take it as a policy priority. There are a lot of things that can be done. It's not only moderating content on social media and doing it better. It's not only giving some money to independent media. It's also applying better standards of protection of data. It's applying better standards of infrastructures, ensuring that internet access is guaranteed, that Gaza will be rebuilt. And obviously, this is not their main priority for Palestinians maybe today from a donor's perspective, but that Gaza will be rebuilt not with a 2G network, but with a functioning at least 4G network that can be independent from Israeli control, that can be ensured to continue operating at all times, and that can foster a digital economy that can make people safer, can make reliable information circulate, and all of that.
Alessandro Accorsi, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thanks to you.
Where have you seen disinformation used in the Middle East? Who seems to be behind it, and how do you know that it's disinformation?
I've seen all kinds of disinformation in the Middle East, and it's really gotten worse, obviously, as internet culture becomes more ubiquitous. And there's different reasons for using it. I remember when the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was, considered a dissenter, was in the West. He had a conversation with a young Saudi activist talking about how alarmed he was that so many people in Saudi Arabia seemed to hate him because he was getting all of this hate online. And the young activist told him most of these accounts are fake. And so there's this way of demoralizing an opposition or demoralizing any kind of dissent. And we saw this in Syria as well. There's just this idea where you can overwhelm the information space if you can't control it. And I think states are particularly adept at doing that because they have the resources to do it, especially, oil-rich Gulf states, but also the Syrian regime. There was actually, I think, a kind of utility to it as people wanted to move beyond the Syrian conflict as well. I remember talking to Jordanian experts and officials, talking to them about the chemical weapons attacks, which we know were perpetrated by the regime. But they would say, oh, the Russians told us it's something different. And we said, well, but that's a lie, right? It sort of complicated the environment enough to allow people that, either wanted to move on from the conflict or do bad things to be able to do so without people questioning it too much in sort of the international space.
And I certainly have seen a lot more of people trying to crowd out good information by just making people believe no information. I mean, the idea of fake news is relatively new in the United States, but fake news was boiled into the information environment in places like Syria, oftentimes in places like Egypt. The point is not that the stories are believable. The point is suggesting that no stories are believable. But the other piece is I've seen Western disinformation filtering its way into the Middle East. I've seen Russian disinformation filtering its way into the Middle East. And again, a lot of this is not so much about convincing people. It's about convincing people that it's all either entertainment, it's all fake, and the hard realities just don't really apply.
How do you think the commercialization and privatization of disinformation will shape its future use in the Middle East?
Well, I think two things that Alessandro suggested that are worth thinking about. One is that wealthier actors are going to have more ability to do it. But the other piece is the more commercialized it is, I think that leads you also to smaller, more targeted campaigns. What I think Natasha and I saw a lot of are things that are directed toward whole societies, the whole information environment. And we may be moving to a space where people are using it more tactically, almost more surgically, to try to move things in a more focused way, rather than saying, oh, well, we'll do this as one of 80 things we're doing. I think we may see more sophisticated and targeted efforts to come in at individuals, at organizations, at issues, and to really move the needle, not because it's such a large effort, but because it's such a focused effort.
If you pull back and you think as to why certain states use non-state actors or proxy groups to either commit human rights violations or fight for them, it's to create an air of plausible deniability. And I think that this is exactly what's happening in the information space as well. There's going to be state actors like Russia uses Wagner. There are going to be actors like Israel using, Israeli tech companies or other tech companies in other parts of the world to spread disinformation, to amplify disinformation, to curb any kind of counter arguments. And we've already seen that, especially in Israel. I mean, I do think that part is concerning. The other thing that you see, though, is sort of influencers or people who are just simply famous spreading disinformation. And it's unclear if they are linked to a state or not linked to a state. But we certainly saw this with the fires in California. I mean, it was immediately you saw famous actors that were supportive of President Trump spreading a lot of stories with regards to the fires that were very dangerous and I think meant to stir up discontent, polarization. It's really difficult to actually tie a political actor to those specific influencers. And it's the same in the Middle East to a certain extent.
Given the foreign policy of the new U.S. administration, how should the U.S. government respond to these challenges?
In part, we have an administration that wants to go after these guys as good as they get. And you have a president who wants to unsettle the environment and is sometimes very persuasive, can totally change the news cycle based on things that may not have gotten a lot of premeditation. Certainly we saw that with the Gaza initiative. I wouldn't even call it a plan, that completely reoriented thinking about the Arab-Israeli conflict in a very short period of time and has continued to dominate it. The other piece of it, of course, is if you're cutting out foreign aid is one of the avenues through which the U.S. was trying to build more resilient societies, to try to help open up the information space in closed places. And for what Alessandro was talking about, that doesn't seem, at least in the near term, to be in the toolkit of the U.S. government. I think what we're going to see more of is the U.S. sort of fighting back like for like, rather than really trying to create more resilient societies. I don't think you're going to see the U.S. moving to improve the quality of the information space so much as it is willing to push back and counterattack on others' efforts to sully the information space. Maybe that's more effective than trying to disprove all the garbage that's out there. I'm not really sure, but it certainly seems to me that traditional effort will be the adults in the room, and others will do crazy things, but we'll stay above it. When they go low, we go high, to quote Michelle Obama. And I think you're going to see the U.S. being much more combative, perhaps more successful, but we also may be seeing a much murkier information space because people may feel there's nothing they can count on.
I think the issue with the we go high, they go low, is that's not really how social media works. It is meant to trigger anger and discontent in people. Lies spread very rapidly on social media because people want to believe certain things that they already assume, as Alessandro was saying. And let's be really honest. I mean, President Trump and those around him saw that many years ago, and they figured out a way to win the information war. And they have been very successful in winning the information war over the Democratic Party, I would say, for several years now. It's going to be very, very difficult to beat someone who is flooding the information space on a regular basis. It's going to be very difficult to inform real policy. I think on the ground, the kind of details that need to be worked out in a place like Gaza or anywhere else in the world for that matter, this is not what this president is interested in. He is interested in reshaping societies, the world, to center him and his interests, essentially. And he's been wildly successful at doing this. It's been 2 weeks or something. When it gets down to the policies that people need to survive all around the world, the transparency that we need all around the world to make good policy, that's when I get scared. And I think that there are ways to maneuver within the government right now, but it's going to be really, really challenging if we don't have the information that we need to make good policy.
John, Natasha, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Marty.
Thanks, Marty.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.